Now, moving forward to our next segment, we have a panel discussion on steward leadership in action. And this discussion will focus on the impact of Steward Leadership 25 and showcase some key trends emerging from this inaugural list. The judges and partners will discuss the implications of a list that urges business leaders to go beyond regulatory compliance and measurement to create a culture of genuine steward leadership. So, with that, please join me in welcoming up on stage our panel for this, Mr. Jaime Ho, editor, The Straits Times, SBH Media Trust. Professor Tommy Koh, Ambassador at Large, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore. Tan Sri Dr. Rebecca Fatima Star Maria, Executive Director, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Secretariat, Singapore. And of course, Dr. Vinika Rao, Executive Director, INSEAD EMI, and Asia Director, Hoffmann Institute. Now, this panel will be moderated by Mr. Shai Ganu, Managing Director, WTW. Big round of applause for our panel and moderator today. All right, are we all comfortable? Okay, Mr. Ganu, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What a wonderful celebration that was. And I know there were a lot of smiling faces and celebrating successes, but there's a lot of hard work that goes behind these. And each of the SL25 winners, heartiest congratulations on behalf of all the partners and judges. So it's my distinct pleasure to moderate this panel. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Shai, but I'm not shy. And that's not the first time I've used that joke, by the way. So please keep that spirit of the candor and not being shy when you ask questions. And there is a Pigeonhole app in your QR code, so feel free to ask questions and I'll monitor the chat as we go along. I won't try to introduce our very distinguished panelists because I will be doing them disservice, and the MC very kindly already introduced them, and we only have 40 minutes, which is a very short time for such a meaningful discussion. So we'll jump straight into the Q&A, if you don't mind, and we'll start with you, Vinika. Maybe before we start celebrating this SL25, just to level set, what does steward leadership mean to you, and how should people here start thinking about this?
Well, that's the fundamental question of the day anyways.
Indeed.
Yes, and I do think, Shai, that this is a very appropriate time for us to be having this conversation, this discussion about what does steward leadership mean to each of us as individuals and as organizations, leaders of business, education, policy. I know we have representatives from all sectors here. Even as we're coming out of or slowly limping to recovery from one variant of COVID-19 and bracing ourselves for the next pandemic, the ravages of war have been visited upon us, nuclear armament in various unstable parts of the world, and of course the planet is at the brink of climate catastrophe. And this has all happened because of a complete disregard and lack of respect for the multiple stakeholders that we work with, that we influence with our activities. And I think a lack of stewardship of the resources that we work with and the communities that we operate within. I think that as a business school, as an institute of higher education, we have a special role to play in this regard, and I really think we have special responsibility to take, because we do influence the minds of all of the thousands of young people who come to us for business degrees, and many executives, including many in this room that I met today, who come to us for various management education and sort of refresher programs, etc. We have the opportunity to guide responsible leadership for today and for the future. So it is important to take that into account. We used to talk about ourselves as being the business school for the world, given our geographical spread. But now we prefer to think of ourselves as the business school for a better world. And I request that you look beyond the cliche and look at what that really means in terms of this whole idea of stewardship. And with my experience in the classroom, I know that it's always better to give specific examples rather than long definitions. Just to quickly sort of give you a few examples of what we look at in terms of stewardship. The Hoffmann Institute that's partnering with SAC on this initiative was actually set up a few years ago with the express vision of transforming business education and of helping business organizations to intentionally deliver profit with societal progress. What that has meant for us is that we have re-examined our curriculum. We look at all of the courses that we teach. It's not just about having an elective on sustainability, for instance, which we do. It's about re-examining everything that we teach, whether it's accountancy or marketing, and sort of looking at where we can bring in this idea of responsibility and going beyond just accountability and what's required. It has also meant that we've had a lot of push from our alumni, from our students. We have alumni who are doing, who are organizing climate summits, who are doing community action challenges. We have our own students who I was just talking to a group earlier this morning, who've just organized an SDG week, and they're now pushing us to do more and more in those directions. And I think also as an institute of sort of academic education, what we think about is what we do best is create and disseminate knowledge. And so that's where we're focusing our resources for research into these areas. We have a center for income inequality. We have a center for research on emerging markets. And we don't try to do all of this alone. We work with collaborators. The Singapore Economic Development Board has supported us in this regard. What we're doing with SAC is also something that becomes very important. So I think, so what does stewardship mean to me is actually about going a giant step beyond talking about building a business case for doing the right thing. It's about doing exactly what all of our previous speakers have talked about, which is working together towards building a better collective future.
Very well said. And it does talk about the importance of ecosystems and collaboration. And I often use this phrase when it comes to climate change, that the need of the hour is not competition, but collaboration. So thank you. That's a very good way of setting us up today. Tanshi, Dr. Rebecca, if I may turn to you now. And first of all, thank you for being one of the judges in this process, because your contributions were invaluable. So we really appreciate that. But as you were going through the judging process and looking at the different submissions, what were the trends that stood out to you?
Yep. Yeah, before I get to trends, when I was looking at it, we had a fantastic, choices. I mean, the list was long. So for me, it was answering 3 questions. What do you want to do? And that, I suppose, was part of the conversation today about purpose. What are you going to do? What do you want to do? Or what are you doing? And the second question was, why are you doing it? So those 2 questions are very important for me. And the third question is something I always ask of various initiatives. So what? You can do all these, but for what? And to what end? So when I looked at the list that was provided to us to go through, those 3 questions kept coming back. And I must say, you had various examples of how folks were reaching out, whether to community, et cetera, et cetera. And in a way, I'd be answering one of your questions there. For me, it was not just an event, not just an initiative, but what was the sustainability about it? What was the impact about that initiative? And was it something that was conceived by the C-suite and didn't really matter to the folks down? The folks down the line just went through the motions? Or was it really, driven by the whole organization? Did the C-suite, the leaders within the organization, manage to convince those within all the employees that this is something that we must do for the greater good? So that was what drove me. And when I looked at those applications, there were clearly some that were different from the others, purely by the impact and the reach that they had, and how committed was the organization, the rest of the organization, not just the C-suite. And I must thank some of the due diligence work that was done, because you get all of these, and Rajiv alluded to this, greenwashing, purpose washing. So yes, you have all these lovely stories, wonderful stories, but verify. For me, that was so important, and I must thank your organization for providing us that basis for saying, yes, this is a standout versus maybe not so.
Thank you for the kind words. We'll definitely pass them to our research team. Professor Ko, if I may turn to you now. And again, thank you for being another one of the judges on SL25 and giving us your valuable time and insights. Were there any initiatives that inspired you, and would you like to share some examples so that it could inspire the rest of the group here as well?
Sure. I find all the 25 initiatives to be inspiring in their own ways.
Well said.
So what I like to do now is to highlight 5 honorees, 3 banks, and 2 real estate developers. Because of the nefarious activities of American bankers and the inadequate supervision by regulators, we had a 2008 financial crisis. The crisis contaminated the rest of the world and almost precipitated the Second Great Depression. Because of this, banks and bankers suffered a huge reputation loss. So I'm happy to say the 3 Singapore banks are an exception to the rule. DBS, OCBC, UOB exemplify good governance. They support ESG and the sustainable development goals. And I salute all 3 of them for their support of ESG and sustainable goals and the fight against climate change. I commend DBS and OCBC for their decision to stop funding the coal industry. I commend OCBC for a deep commitment to sustainability. I now take on the next 2 honorees.
Please.
You know, from the point of view of the green movement to which I belong, real estate developers are seen as killer of trees and destroyers of our natural environment. So why am I mentioning capital land and city development? Capital land is trying to promote sustainability in the built environment. And believe it or not, city development has become a thought leader in sustainability. So these are the 5 honorees I wish to commend.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Goh. And particularly, some of these names have been very active and very generous, these companies, in lending not just their thought leadership, but also their resources to raise the collective consciousness within Singapore Inc. So I really appreciate that. Jaime, if we may turn to you. And again, thank you for being a partner organization to SL25. Why is it important to highlight purpose-driven initiatives and organizations? And why might a list like this serve to inspire others?
Yeah, let me, obviously this is very important to give the perspective on how we can get the message out. And obviously, as news media, is part of our jobs as well to tell these positive stories. And first, congratulations to all 25, of course. But maybe I'll start by just talking about some of the concerns that I have in leading a newsroom as we see the overall news agenda and how we are able to reflect all these positive stories that emerge. And I'll be very honest, I mean, one of the biggest concerns that I have is a global, a regional, and even a local trend in people being news fatigued. There's a lot of avoidance, news avoidance. There's also a lot of cynicism. And if you look at what's happening around the world today, a lot of the news that we have is always driven by crisis. It's always driven by bad news. And you add to that, frankly speaking, bad behavior by companies. You see that every other day, whether it's Theranos, as we saw, or whether it's FTX. All this drives the news agenda. So the challenges for you all as organizations and for us within the newsrooms is how we help each other tell these positive stories that contribute to the type of stories that people want to read. It's never always just about crises. It's not always about problems. Even if we do know from the data these days, that's what people somehow or other end up reading. But I think a lot of the problems, therefore, are self-evident enough that people want to read about solutions. And that's where everyone has to think about how are the things that you do contributing to solutions. And I would say the more that we can focus on solutions, obviously the better. So all in all, I'd say we are actually not in a very comfortable position, I'll be honest, in terms of being able to have the space to talk about positive stories. But again, initiatives like these are going to be very, very important. So in terms of potentially being prescriptive. What can we do better? I would say not just focus on solutions, but I think all your stories are crucial. And I would say, being able to tell that is just one part of the equation. I think we can do two other things. I can suggest to organizations, look beyond yourselves as you tell the stories of what you're doing. Think about individuals, the communities, the specific people who are benefiting from this. That's how, at the end of the day, all our stakeholders are looking at the effects of all the good work that you're doing. Secondly, I think as far as possible, be honest. We really have to be increasingly honest with a very, very sort of eagle-eyed audience these days and eagle-eyed stakeholders. As I was listening this morning, you hear the simple catchphrase of just do good. We're all here just to do good. And it sounds simple, and I was reminded of President Obama when he was asked to describe his foreign policy, right? And the urban legend that he said this on a plane to a bunch of reporters, and he said, just don't do stupid shit, right? Don't do stupid shit. That was his, frankly, pithy advice, but it's so much harder than that. We all know that, right? The simpler it sounds, actually the harder it is. And I think we would do well, all of us, in explaining to our stakeholders just how complicated it is sometimes to do good. It's easier said than done, and the more honest that we can get, I think, the wider the buy-in that we will get from our audiences. I'll say one final point then before that you ask questions. Sure. As we talk about all this, I think as we talk about stakeholders, I want to make a pitch for the youth of today. I think the youth of today are the most empowered, the most powerful, and the most energized youth that we have. They are probably the largest stakeholders that any of us have, whether in the newsroom or as organizations. And we have to do much better in being able to engage with them, find out, and they are the ones who are driving, for example, the ESG agenda, the climate agenda, and how we reach out to them and what the stories that we tell to them will be the game changer. I'm reminded of, I think I remember it was in June when I spoke to a room full of university students from around the region, and we were talking about things like climate doomerism, climate pessimism, and how do we get beyond that? Again, it goes back to the first thing that I said. How do we get beyond the bad news of the day, and how do we tell the positive stories that can engage and energize the youth?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I just can add, talking about good news, and there's some companies that are in industries that are very challenging when you talk of climate change and emissions. And I must point out one of the companies that we went through. They are in, if you're in agriculture or in husbandry, those are really difficult, very challenging industries today. So this company actually did well, reaching out to community, really assisting the community. Besides that, they also, for their own industry, they looked at standards and humane ways of, rearing cattle, for example. So there are things that can be done even in the most challenging of industries, in the most, what you would consider most climate unfriendly, you know. But yes, there are stories that you can bring out from these sort of initiatives that have been put in place, and I really commend that company, because it's not easy.
No.
My daughter refuses to drink milk, cow's milk, but I have to tell her that it's not all bad news out there. Yeah. There are folks who are actually trying to counter that, and do things more humanely for the. Is that animal humanely? Yeah, but along those lines, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And actually, this is a really good segue, because I was keen to get, Vinika, your thoughts on this as well. About how would you judge positive steward leadership initiatives that come from controversial industries or companies, right? Because sometimes we do need our best leaders in poorest performing either businesses or tainted industries. So how would you go about judging that, and what advice would you have for companies here?
Yeah, that's an important question that actually we've debated many times in this journey, and I was thinking of this as you were speaking. And I remember even when, Rajiv and I had the first conversation about whether we would partner on this project, this was a question that we grappled with also. So I think it's a very important point to think about. And really the point that needs to be made is that the most important examples need to come from exactly the areas where we've had problems in the past, right? Because after all, there are undoubtedly some companies that have always had a reasonably good track record. But if we are only talking to them and only talking about their stories, then as the minister was saying earlier today, we're preaching to the choir. We're leaving a large part of the audience completely unaddressed. And if we really have to make a difference here, the impact will have to come from these so-called controversial or difficult industries. And we had a wonderful example this morning that I think we can quote. Our sponsor is in an industry that is a difficult industry. And palm oil has had all sorts of issues associated with it, and yet we have this shining beacon to quote what was said earlier today, of an example that's been made where you can do very difficult things in a wonderfully sort of appropriate way from that point of view. So I do think that becomes important. And it's also important always to acknowledge that nobody is really doing everything right. We're a long way from being able to say, even though earlier today on that sort of continuum that you showed us, Rajiv, whether we really have any champions. We do have some that are trying very hard. But all of us need to do more. Again, this is a business school parlance, but basically the best examples always come from failures. What didn't work and what are some mistakes that have been made by others, and how can then we sort of rework those and make sure that the same mistakes are not made again. So in short, I think we absolutely need to pick up initiatives that have done well, examples from companies and industries, irrespective of where they're from, what size they've been, and which industries they've been associated with. Because if we try to look for the perfect organization, I'm sorry, but really there isn't anyone who's doing everything right just yet. So yes, absolutely, I would suggest we pick initiatives that have done well and make examples out of those, because those are the ones that will have the most impact.
Very well said. And you reminded me of this folk wisdom that a good person learns from their own mistakes, but a smart person learns from somebody else's mistakes.
Exactly.
And so you need to use both these shining examples as well as lessons learned so that you can further your own agenda within your organizations.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that, Vinika. Professor Koh, if we may come back to you. So how do some of these initiatives address some of the most pressing issues and challenges of the day, including some that we talked about earlier, climate change, social inequality, access to healthcare, and broadly, even investment stewardship?
Sure. In my answer to your first question,
Please.
I highlighted the initiatives of 5 big companies. So now I want to focus on the small and medium companies and some social enterprises.
Please.
So let me just mention a few of them. Angkas of the Philippines, Ford Coffee of Singapore, Ganesh Team of Singapore, Noboro of Thailand, and the Social Kitchen of Singapore have initiatives to help the low income, persons with disabilities, and other marginal groups. And I commend them for that. The initiative by the AFTA Group of India will promote gender equality. The initiative of Rich 52 of Thailand will bring health care to the rural people of Thailand. The initiative by Mandai Wildlife Group of Singapore will help to protect the habitat of the primates in Indonesia. And finally, Guava, the initiative of Guava, will support sustainability and the circular economy.
Excellent. Thank you. And again, a lot of inspirational stories through all these companies. There is a theme, though, is there not, in what we've been discussing all today or this morning, that people or companies who do this well, this being embedding sustainability and steward leadership as part of their business strategies, they're not doing this solely out of the goodness of their hearts, right? And rather, research has taught us, and WTW, we did a global study of more than 500 non-executive directors globally, And we found that the companies who are championing this change are realizing the business benefits that come from sustainability being a core part of your strategy and steward leadership being an extension of that. Do you have any counsel for companies here? I mean, this is not CSR. This is a business initiative.
Yes. Yeah, if I may, there's, well, I'm going to shout out to Sunway and the Sunway City. If you look at the story behind the Sunway City, it's an amazing thing. You have this abandoned tin mining land, you know, which is given new life. And not just new life, it's contributing, it's being an exemplar of what can be done when you look at townships, smart townships, sustainable townships, and integrated townships. You know, so, and it's grown, and it's driven by vision of the founder, but it permeates the whole organization. That is something that is so important, to be able to get that message and that vision, you know, right through your organization, so that if you pick anybody and ask them the pride with which they share the founder's story, it's become their story. You know, so these are, again, important. You know, you were talking of construction being one of those industries, right? But here's an example, and I think we need to have more of these stories out there. And just also another shout out. I'm Malaysian, so you have to forgive me. To Farm Fresh. This is one of those industries, you know, dairy industry. It's getting a bad rap, right? Yeah. But how have they done? What have they done to deal with it? You know, and their story is a simple story. This is a small company that has grown again from a vision of the founder, and it permeates the organization, and then to the community. You know, so these are important stories that we all can learn from and build on. Yep.
Excellent, thank you. Vinika, maybe coming to you again on this notion of sustainability and business strategy being intertwined and integral to each other, and they're not, it's not an initiative, it's not something that you do on the side. It needs to be germane to how you run your businesses. Any thoughts on how companies should be thinking about this?
You know, and I was looking at some of the questions that have come up which touch upon this. So, you know, the whole idea of, so do shareholders not matter anymore? Of course not. That's not what we're talking about. But I think the important thing is to start thinking of the shareholders as one of the stakeholders, right, that we have to work with. And I know, I mean, you know, everyone in this room is obviously part of that choir we were talking about. So, of course, you're all nodding. But there are many others that still don't buy that. Yeah. You know, and so the idea that shareholders are important and the company was set up for a certain reason is, of course, crucial. But also realizing that, yes, I think the business case has been established, has been talked about, but really we're at a point of no return. We are at a point of no choices anymore, where we're going to have to recognize that we're going to have to do this together, and it can't be about just the shareholders. So I think as long as that comes into the picture, it's about multiple stakeholders, and these stakeholders are not just the people that you see inside your company, it's also people outside, it's also the environment. Certainly it's the planet, because all of us have a rather large and important stake in that, and there is no planet B as far as we know that is habitable, so we better get used to that idea. And if I may, just the one other point I wanted to make, you know, we've been talking about values a lot today, and I think one value that is often overlooked when we talk about stewardship values is humility. You know, I was listening to Erica's comments about what happened with Tyrannus, and we had the opportunity to talk earlier today. And one of the things that really was missing was humility with the founder. When things start to go wrong, if you have the humility to acknowledge, I've made a mistake, you know, and I can step back from this, then that goes a long way. And I think with a lot of these stories that we continue to hear, we've already accepted that we don't learn from our mistakes. We keep on making the same mistakes. We have, you know, very infamous examples now of what's happening with cryptocurrency and various other things that I won't get into. It is similar sorts of issues that are coming up. And to Rajiv's point earlier, regulations don't help. Right? So it's about, I think if every founder, for instance, had just a sense of humility to be able to acknowledge mistakes or to acknowledge that we don't know everything and that we can learn from each other, then that in itself will go a huge way towards setting the right tone when we talk about the values.
Can I disagree with her?
Please.
By all means, please.
I think more important than humility is integrity. What happened in Theranos is that
Yes.
the founder didn't have integrity.
True.
She invented a defective device and she would con everybody. And I don't know what's the moral of the story, How could a young woman who invented a defective device raise so much money from credible people and persuaded some of the iconic men of America to join the board of directors? I know what's the moral of the story.
Yeah, the big takeaway for me is before joining any board, do your due diligence.
Yes.
No. I think the moral of the story is that the world is full of people with no integrity. Yeah. If you have integrity, you wouldn't.
Yes.
If you have integrity, you wouldn't have Theranos. You wouldn't have.
You would have a lot of For leadership, I think the moral compass. That's
of course.
And we are we've gone through it. When I say we, I'm talking about Malaysia in general. Maybe some other countries in the region. No moral compass. Leaders without moral compass, you just don't bring yourself down. You bring your impact is immense for the country.
Absolutely.
Well, I totally agree with Ambassador Koh, which is often the case. On a more sort of positive or less negative perspective in terms of values, I would say another very important value in steward leadership is authenticity.
Yep.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Because it's only through that you can firstly be honest in the challenges that you face from certain, as you say, Rebecca, challenging industries. But at the same time, I would say increasingly stakeholders are more and more acutely aware of inauthentic behaviors and inauthentic claims that companies and organizations will make. And I think increasingly, just like integrity, authenticity is an increasingly rare commodity as well. And the more that organizations and companies like those here can show off and come across as authentic as possible, I think they're better for everyone.
And even in the point about stakeholders, and much as I said that we have to look at all stakeholders also have a responsibility to take.
Absolutely.
And even as we were talking about this, I had a young alumnus who was sitting next to me who was talking about the pressure that she feels as a startup founder from her investors. Just the constant need to keep on delivering and not being able to take a step back to say maybe some things are not quite working out. So when we talk about, all the stakeholders that we need to be careful about, each of our stakeholders also needs to take responsibility. And to your point, Prof. Tommy, yes, absolutely. Of course, integrity is without question something that, is a crucial value. Why I was saying humility is that I find that is one of those values that doesn't get talked about as much, but which I think helps with that point of being, when you can acknowledge that, you need to take a step back or you're not getting things right. And again, to Theranos' story, what was interesting with Erica was that, she was saying that I don't think it started off with the intention to commit fraud, but she just wasn't able to stop when she realized that things weren't going well.
This is again a wonderful reminder and a quick plug to Stewardship Asia Center when they talk about the Steward Leadership Compass, because a lot of the things that we've been talking about, the values and the leadership attributes, goes at a fundamental of the steward leadership model, where you take elements of stewardship, elements of leadership, and that's what's needed for a better collective future. I should get royalties from Rajiv now. But we have about 8 minutes or so left, so let's turn to some of the audience questions. And Jaime, maybe I'll start with you. And so I'll add a little bit of my question and then I'll go there. So when we look at the SL25 inaugural list, it was a good mix of large cap companies, some small to medium enterprises, and some social enterprises. Also a good mix of Singapore, Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific. Now, I know we all would admit that probably it had a stronger concentration in Southeast Asia, and we could do more to get stories from outside. So the question, which was, why have you chosen to support SL25, which is from the audience? And then I'm adding my question to it, how can we get more stories from other parts of Asia Pacific as well?
Well, as to why, I think it's quite clear. I think all newsrooms, as we look at the challenges that our audiences face and the bad news, as I said, that they are barrage of that every single day, we are proactively looking for positive stories to tell that offer solutions, that offer a way out for us as humanity, whether it's climate change or whatever the challenge is. In terms of what more we can do in terms of getting the stories out, I think, frankly, and this is where I'll stake my newsroom on it, that it's up to us to find the stories too. Yes, SL25 is a good starting point, but it's only a starting point.
Absolutely.
I personally would rather find the stories that come from much smaller organizations. It's not always the banks, right? And it shouldn't always be the banks. I think within, especially Southeast Asia, there are so many micro stories, not so micro stories, that actually, as we've said in past sessions, that offer much more inspiration, right? As Ms. Chan said, for those who have the least, sometimes they can also contribute, and if we find those stories, I think those are far more inspirational sometimes than the banks, even if the banks do well.
Excellent, thank you. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's so many great examples. I would encourage everybody to go through the list of SL25, including some of the ones that, for example, creation of bioplastic from farm-led innovation that Taiwan has done. Some really good examples that are actually tackling some big issues that all of us are facing. Okay, the question to whoever wants to take this, and it's an interesting one, where what happens when an employee's purpose differs from an organization's purpose?
Yeah, this is what I meant when I said that, yes, it can be a C-suite initiative, but if that doesn't permeate through the organization, then you're just going through the motions, it will not be sustainable. Yeah. So for any initiative to scale and be sustainable, it has to, those values must be seen across, must be absorbed across the organization. And, there were cases in my past when if it was at cross purposes, you leave. As Erika did. After a while, you cannot, to be authentic and to have integrity, you cannot tolerate that. You have to leave.
Fair enough. There's another question, and I know we touched upon this briefly earlier. So maybe, Vinika, we might start with you. Are there businesses which should be ended? For example, tobacco companies or other harmful companies which should not be allowed to exist? And sort of how do we evolve and do well by doing good?
This is like the one question you look at in an exam paper and hope it's not asked. Because there's no easy answer to this one, honestly. And I can't pretend that I know what's the right answer to that. I think what we can hope for and, then work with such organizations is to say then minimize, the negative aspects of what you're causing. To be absolutely pragmatic about this, all tobacco companies are not going to shut down tomorrow. And I think some are beginning to take some actions that then again come into the realm of, positive initiatives by an industry which may not be the best one in this regard. And I really think that being completely pragmatic, that's the best that we can hope for right now. I hope I'm wrong, and if it works, that's great. But I don't think I'll be saying that that's the right thing.
The reason I picked that question is I know even the tobacco industry was listed as an example. There are parallels with other industries, particularly coal-fired power plants.
Yes.
And a lot of energy companies in the last few years have been on a journey of trying to divest their coal-fired power plants. But divesting your power plants does not solve the problem. It just makes it somebody else's problem.
Yeah,
exactly.
Agree.
Yeah.
Right? And we need a bigger, more systemic solution to some of this. And particularly in that example, kudos to the Asian Development Bank, where in this part of the world, they set up a consortium with different financial services, and they bought with the intent of decommissioning such power plants. But the answer can't be just shutting down industries. The answer has to be finding sustainable solutions. We're running out of time, so maybe one last question. Purposeful leadership takes a longer time frame to show results. Performance evaluation and promotion is based on yearly results. So how do you get buy-in when it could be a competitive disadvantage? And I guess inherent in this question is also, how do you manage this tension, not between purpose and profits, because that's the wrong question to ask, but how do you manage the tension between short-term profits and long-term profits?
You know, there's a statistic we quote about the average life cycle of the American CEO. I'm sure you've seen it.
Yeah.
It's a few years, right? 3 years, something like that. So now here's the person who's responsible for a lot of these decisions you're taking, and if their life term or their sort of position in that term is only a few years, then yes, exactly, you know, they're not going to take a particularly long-term view. I used to be a banker in a former life, and I remember we used to talk about this all the time. It was about, you know, your targets were about meeting your targets for the year. And who cared what happened to the loans after you were promoted or had moved to another division? And unfortunately, that is absolutely this tension that you're speaking about. But I think the minister made a really wonderful point earlier today when he spoke about, you know, even in politics, when you're talking about the next election, or are you going to talk about what happens to the future generation? And again, it's not an easy question to answer, but absolutely, this is a tension. I think the good thing that's happening is organizations are beginning to realize that. And there have been some really good examples. Unilever, for instance, you know, very publicly made this whole announcement about how they were going to take a longer-term view on profits. And
but we can do some simple things.
Please.
Abolish quarterly reporting.
I was just going to go down that route.
It
was that conversation, wasn't there?
Yes,
there was a conversation.
It's a wicked American invention
Quarterly report.
that has been accepted by the world.
Yeah.
When I was on the board of DBS Bank, and I had a wonderful chairman, Dana Balan, who's left us, we objected to quarterly reporting. But we were not strong enough to resist the wave, you know. So in the end, we had to give in. Short-termism is a very bad thing.
Absolutely.
So from today's proceeding, I kind of envious family company like Mars and Ayala. but most of us cannot be family company. So what can we do in a publicly listed company? I think you need visionary leaders. You need good core values. And what we need is therefore performance with purpose.
Well said.
And many great companies have shown that you can do both. You can achieve great results, but with purpose.
Yep. Absolutely.
I don't think we're going to top that
On that
last
note.
statement.
On that
It's a wonderful note to end. We're out of time as well. Professor Ko, Tan Sri,
Thank you.
Jaime, Vinika, thank you very much for your time.
Thank
We
you.
really appreciate
Thank you.
it. Thank you.
It was lovely.
Thank you. I know, it was so nice to meet you.